As we conclude Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony, I wanted to kind of think about the topographies that are present here, the geographies that get drawn, and how the land gets described or invoked in Silko's prose. And the overwhelming question overall is, can land be put back together through story? And that's her concern in this novel, right? Is that the sense of the physical land that's been marked by the U.S. nuclear research that ends World War II in the 1940s, and the kind of collective and personal traumas that arise from that war and that violence. She notes on page 169, right, that every day the Laguna had to look at the land from horizon to horizon, and every day the loss was with them. And this is a sense of the loss of the land, in the physical sense of loss of land, but also the other senses as well, right? The woundedness of the land from the violence that it feeds and perpetrates through the witcheries, as Battani calls them in Ceremony. Battani himself, thinks about the personal traumas in this regard when he speaks to Teo when he first meet in that hospital. Battani says they don't bury the dead; they keep them in rooms and talk to them. So there's a very kind of like wounded sense of the world that's here, a traumatized sense of the world that is felt both within the land and within the human and tribal worlds as well. At the core of this is who owns the land in the end. And there's a moment where Teo, as he's cutting into some barbed wire, cuts into the wire as if cutting away the lie inside himself. So it's a reflection of both of setting the land free and also setting himself free. If the white people never looked beyond the lie to see that theirs was a nation built on stolen land, they would never know how they were still being used by the witchery. And so Teo's moment of realization and recognition here, right, is that sense that the land's woundedness, the land's stolen disposition is that he is trying through the ceremony to renew the land, and his act is one of trying to not only free himself but to free others in the sense of how they are controlled by larger forces here. For Silko, this gets invoked in a sense of the new U.S. nuclear program at Los Alamos that produces the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan to end World War II in 1945, and Teo is very much aware of this, and as he conducts the ceremony. Los Alamos, only 100 miles northeast of him now, there was no end to it. It knew no boundaries, and he had arrived at the point of convergence where the fate of all living things and even the earth had been laid. And so there's this sense in which the witcheries that are being practiced are being practiced on the land, that are calling up out of the land an unimaginable violence for Teo. And he is, through the ceremony, he is coming kind of face to face with that in this moment. And it's a witchery that is can be thought of in ceremonial terms, but it's also a witchery that can be thought of in scientific terms, according to Silko's reflections here. Teo's larger journey, through this space of the West, is to try to put a land back together through stories, and that's what Battani encourages him to do, to see the land as it is, and to see the witcheries as they are here. Part of Teo's journey is just kind of a deliberation of a sense of his life with the women, his mother, Montano, Se, and even the land itself becomes, this female presence in Teo's larger journey here. That journey is a recovery of center as well, that the novel works towards a center. It's centripetal in a way, right? That everything moves towards those last closing moments of the ceremony itself. That moment in which every evil which entangled him was cut to pieces. And so the Teo's invocation of the ceremony, his ritual actions become a matter of finding himself and finding his belongingness to the land in the end. Within that journey, there are also moments where he recovers a sense of deliberation in life, and one of those moments is that strange moment on page 179 where you turn the page and you come face to face with a drawing of the night sky, and he looks up to see old Batani stars, and in some ways, how does that image narrate itself as clearly as the words on the page do? And so, Silko was dealing with texts other than the sense of ink on the page or the digital text here as well. And one other thing that's part of Teo's journey is that that whereas the old war stories were kind of told as a desperate attempt to forget the violence that he and others in the tribe had suffered through in going to war in the Pacific in World War II, that there's an injunction within the ceremony to remember everything, as noted on page 235. So memory becomes an important part of this journey as well. A lot of the topographical significance in this novel is kind of played through symbol as well. There's always a sense that Teo's inner world and his outer worlds are are working in parallel. That if Teo's able to kind of reconnect a sense of an outer a center to the outer world, he'll be able to kind of reconnect with a center to his inner world as well. And here you can kind of think about maybe like the spaces and myth making that generally defines the larger sense of the American West, right? That in the tribal lore, there's an inherent brokenness in the whites take over the land, right? That as Silko notes on page 68, all of creation suddenly had two names now, an Indian name and a white name. And what results from that sense that everything is named twice? How do you put a world together if everything suddenly has two names? That sense of brokenness is there from the roots. Also, the symbolic aspects of Emo's own kind of witchery and violence throughout the course of the novel, also kind of reflects that sense of the insidious violence of the nuclear program at Los Alamos, to the point where Teo has this moment of realization that the Japanese voices had merged with the Laguna voices, that those killed by the atomic bombs in 1945, that those voices that cry out, are similar to the Laguna voices who cry out from the conquest of the West in the end. So there's this parallel sense of the violences perpetrated on others in the name of conquest are a part of the ceremony's direction. In closing, we should rethink the ceremony as a specific literary act here, right? That this is a novel. Is it different from the other novels we've read in the course or other novels that you've worked with in your past reading? What's made here? And there's a very distinct sense that Silko is trying to make something. It's not just a collection of pages and words, right? That she's trying to create something through the text. You can read this as a work of nature writing, right? That in a lot of ways that nature is a force in Silko's novel, right? That's very different from a novel where nature is just kind of a backdrop, where a human drama is kind of played out in the end. So how does nature work as a force in this novel? Ceremony, in terms of its use of narrative, sets Teo's tribal and personal stories here against the larger and national stories that define conquest and define the West. And Silko is trying to kind of reclaim a sense of this smaller story that exists beyond, as she says on page 204, the sterility of white art, which is work to steal from others to build a sense of itself and ends up empty in the end. that those stories often involve, in Silko's estimation, right, the larger narratives of conquest, that those kind of larger narratives of civilization or settlement or manifest destiny in the Americas in particular, and how those stories can be set against the very kind of real personal traumas that arise from the effects of those larger national and corporate stories. And Silko's trying to tell those, that smaller personal trauma against those larger stories. One other thing with the novel that I think is interesting, right, is that how do you read this in some ways maybe as an authorless text too? That the novel is not simply Silko sitting in a room typing away, but it's a gathering of smaller stories. Other voices kind of leak into the text, that oral traditions and sacred stories become a part of the story that Silko is trying to tell here. How does that impact your sense of the novel? In this space in which, Silko, her literary and psychological task in this novel is a lot like Batani's, the healer. What do I make from all this world, right? Where, as Silko notes on pages 186 and 261, right, the balance of the world had been disturbed, and by the end of the ceremony, it is dead for now. 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 In Teo's realization, how is storytelling always about, telling back the forces that would disentangle human connection? And that seems to be the force of Silko's novel.